Hi, I'm Valerie Engelhardt, and in this video I am going to be painting a lily of the valley based on a viewer request. And for this piece, I am going in dark. I want this moody and dramatic. And my reasoning is that I'm going to use a lifting technique to get the bells of the little lilies of the valley. So I need a dark background. So I'm going in dark. This is Lime Green Brown by Rockwell Art, and I'm working on a little block of hot press paper, a Fabriano Fluid 100, and it's only 4x6, and I'm doing that because we are getting into mini season, and what that is galleries in the area getting ready for Christmas want to have small works of art for their gallery shows to encourage people to get Christmas gifts. It might be hard to convince someone to get a giant painting as a gift, but it's a lot easier to convince someone if it's like just this little bitty thing. And, well, painting little bitty is really difficult for me. And so I am just taking things out of my element with this piece. Well, not completely though, I paint a lot of flowers, so it's good to have some similarity. So for this, I am laying down the big blocks of color using a large angular brush, and I'm now going in with a blue that I love but haven't used in quite some time, and that is a Daniel Smith Mayan Blue Genuine. For being one of my favorites, I do not use it nearly enough. So you notice that I'm lifting up my block and I've got a spray bottle, and as I'm spraying, I'm trying to get really fat, loose drops. And I keep pulling out a paper towel so that the excess water and paint can drain onto something. And it gives me these lovely... Now I'm used to doing this on, well, much larger paper and on more of a cold press. It's a learning opportunity, and I like to use my painting time to learn, and that is a bonus of doing these small paintings. Even though it's out of my element, this block of paper was not very expensive. It was roughly $8, and it comes with 15 sheets, and it lets me play around without feeling like if it turns out bad, I'm throwing away a big sheet of paper, because it's one thing to be like, oh, this 4x6 didn't turn out great, but it is another feeling when it's like 18 by 24 inches. So now I'm going to go in and spatter some lavender. And I'm spattering that in, and it's by Daniel Smith, and it's an opaque color. It has white mixed in, but I like the effect when you drop in just that kind of a pigment. And it is looking like a hot mess, but the hot kind of hot. That is a nice mess. I lost that leaf in the back, so I'm trying to bring it in. Even though that is technically a leaf in the back, it doesn't really matter whether or not we can tell that it is, as much as having interesting shapes and contrasting lines. So now I'm starting to lift using my size 3 Da Vinci Cosmo Top Spin, and I'm just trying to lift paint to figure out where I'm going to be putting the stem, where all of these little bellflowers are going to be popping off. And it's a lot of lift the paint, wipe it on the brush, lift more, wipe it on the brush, and eventually my brush picks up too much pigment, and so that's when I will go and rinse off my brush, dry it again, and then lift more paint. And it's good to know the properties of your pigments. I know that these paints do lift very well. So when I picked them, I already knew I wanted to lift off shapes, and I knew that these pigments would lift. If you don't know your pigments very well, I do recommend just playing around on a scrap piece of paper. That's one of the reasons I like to put my paints on just a scrap piece of paper when I paint, because if I am unsure of something, I can do like a quick little doodle on the side and get an idea of what the paints will do. So now I'm going through just with that size 3 synthetic brush and lifting off these bell shapes. And longtime viewers know that I don't sketch anything in advance, typically, And this painting's no different. So I'm just going through and eyeballing my reference image, and I'm not following it exactly. I am using it as inspiration. And I would encourage that because, especially when painting so loosely and almost wildly like this, there's no way I'll have everything set up so I can follow a reference image exactly, or at least usually. So it's just good to know and understand your subject so that, yes, you can use the reference image just as that, a reference. You don't need to be super faithful to it. Another nice thing about lifting is you want to lift in the direction that the petals are going to be going, because pigment will get dragged around, and you can kind of tell we're already getting some separation of petals just because when I lifted pigment, well, the pigment that was on the paper shifted around, and by doing it in the motion of the petals, I created an organic, convincing, three-dimensional form. At least on some of them, especially that one right there in the middle, lower third. Oh, I really like that one. But spoiler alert, I am gonna go in with some white just to bring those out a little more, but I'm not going to paint over all of it. I'm only going to be putting it on certain parts of the bell to give it more contrast from what's going on around it. And another little tip about using reference for your work, that stem should be a light green, like a light yellowy green. I'm going to be leaving it white because I don't want to introduce a yellow late in the painting, and I don't want to paint it green because there's already so much green everywhere else. So what I am going to do is put some white later on the bells, and then I'm just going to leave that stem alone, and that will give it enough of a difference to separate them, but still keep the values interesting. Now, I wasn't getting the deep values I wanted with the paints I already had out, so even though some watercolorists would cringe at this, I grabbed black. But I grabbed a Holbein peach black because I bought it a while ago on another viewer recommendation, but since I don't use black very often, I haven't really used it, and I have a big tube of it, so I figured, well, let's use it. And once again, so I painted in a shape. I painted in like a triangular shape at the top using that angle flat brush and just spritzing a little bit and letting it drain. And you want to, if you're going to do this kind of technique and you want those pattern marks, when you hold your paper at an angle, you want to let that pigment move for quite some time, even like 30 seconds, maybe even up to a minute. I have sped this video up to 200% just because there was a lot of time just holding the block and letting things. And now I'm taking the pigment that's already on the paper, whatever's not moving, and I'm using my size 3 brush just to create like little twigs and texture and stuff, just dragging the pigment around. But it's kind of hard to see because I obviously keep moving things, but look at that triangle that was in black that I painted up towards the top. How it's begun to split, and sure, there's a lot of darkness, but because watercolor is transparent, we're starting to see some of what's underneath, and it's starting to look like a moody night forest scene, which I really like. And lately I've been painting with a lot of like yellows and pinks and really bright greens, so going in dark and moody like this, especially as we are getting into fall, it's just a nice little palette cleanser. I'm going in now. Color doesn't matter as much as value. I am using the Limu Green Brown. It's called Limu Green Brown. It's really just a dark green with some yellow undertones to them. One thing I like about Rockwell art paints is a lot of them do split as you add water. But I just want to create contrast, and so I'm painting negatively around some of the bells, around some parts of the stems. I'm not outlining the bells because then I'm going to lose that looseness and it's going to look cut out, and I want this to look ghostly. I want it to look ethereal and mysterious and a little dreamy. So if I outline everything, I'm taking that away. So there's another lesson for you. Sometimes adding things is actually taking it away. That's a good one. I'm going to write that one down. Confucius moment over here. So I'm going in now. I do want to add a little more dimension to my bells before adding the white, and so I'm going in some places with the lavender because the lavender is not a lot of the color that I have going on elsewhere, but I did spatter it in some places so it exists. I'm not just introducing a new color, but it lets me add shadow to the bells without them getting lost or too ambiguous with the background. Now I noticed that the leaf that was more in the foreground with that one in the background, it was looking a little too outlined, so I'm starting to introduce lines and pigment just to break up that harsh, well, outline. All right, now I've pulled out a small filbert brush. This one is also synthetic because I don't want it to hold a lot of water and I want those bristles to be a little more on the stiff side. And I'm just lifting a little bit more. If you do the lifting too soon, where things around are still wet, then whatever you lift, the paint and water around it will just sort of flood in and cover what you're lifting. So when you do a lifting technique, you do want to let it dry just a little bit. You don't want it to be sopping wet. Maybe wait until like it begins to lose the sheen. And that's a little hard for me to judge on hot press paper. But it is something that you'll just kind of need a feel for, and it will change depending on your climate. I live somewhere by the coast, and it's starting to get a little cooler, and so my drying time has been extended quite a bit recently, just due to the weather. And watercolor gets paler as it dries, so I'm going in, and I'm using the Mayan Blue Genuine, just accenting certain parts around the bells. And if you need to change the shape, that's another great reason for bringing out that darker color and painting negatively. If I had done one of my bells, but I'd gotten the shape wrong, well then just go and paint it back in. You just need to pay attention to how dry your paper is. And I also want to point out that some of the bells are behind other bells. So those ones are far less defined, use more of the lavender. And then to bring out ones where light would be hitting, I pulled out some of my Liquitex white acrylic ink. This is not normally what I use. I usually use gouache, but I was like, I'm doing a lot of new things here. Let's pull out the acrylic ink. I haven't used that in a hot minute. Man, I think I really want to warm up because I keep using the word hot. And I'm going through with this acrylic ink, and I'm using just a size 4 synthetic round brush. I am pulling out all sorts of brushes in this tiny painting. And I'm painting on the bells, but only in certain areas. And even though this is an acrylic ink, I'm able to treat it a lot like gouache in that I can thin it and let some of it be a little more transparent. And then that way I can keep that really soft look to the petals while still giving them a little more definition, bringing them forward in space just a bit. And now I just am going to use some of that black and bring in some more definition. And some of it is going to be working with marks that are already on my paper and accentuating them. Others are just bringing the bells or the stem out. But at this point, I'm going to be making much smaller marks. I'm not going to be doing the same thing every time where I paint like a big shape and then go over it again, go over it again. One of the things about painting negatively is you might paint a big shape, and then within that big shape, you'll paint some smaller shapes. And then once that dries, even smaller shapes within that. And that helps create depth. All right, I've got my size 8 Da Vinci Cosmo Top Spin. I'm using my hand to block some spatter. And I'm just spattering on some of that lavender because I felt like I needed a little more movement and I wanted a little more lavender in the piece. And because it is more opaque, even as it dries, it will stand out a bit. Some of the paint, as you can probably see, is still wet, so some of that lavender gets diffused, and I like that mix of defined circle splatters and some of them just getting lost. I put some at the top too, because usually if you're going to do something in one area, you want to do it on the opposite side, even if only a little. But I found it to be a little too defined, so I used my paper towel to just muck some of it up a bit. But here's the finished painting. If you liked this video, press the like button so I know to make more like it. And if you want to see more, subscribe because I make videos every Monday and Thursday. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!